there's a proud native there. She's probably has the bumper sticker and all. So I'm not a native, and I wouldn't consider myself a wanderer, though I've been a wanderer. We've been in Colorado now for 17 and a half years almost, which is longer than I've lived at any address in any state, which is hard to imagine. But moving brings a lot of emotions, doesn't it? It brings excitement about what's new, but it also brings some trepidation about what's new. There's the concern about leaving friends or family behind. There's what about schools for kids? What's the neighborhood going to look like? What interesting thing am I going to find in my home that the home inspection didn't discover? All those different things. And this week we're in a 9-week series from the book of Daniel called Strangers in a Strange Land, where we're going to look at the Babylonian exile to draw on some lessons for River Church during this interim period. Last week, Michael Spotsville kicked off the series in Jeremiah 29, which is the prophet's letter to the Babylonians, or to the exiles in Babylon, with some important historical background for us. And I thought he did a great job reminding River Church that though we may be in a period of uncertainty and discomfort, our work at Lakewood continues. We continue to integrate into our communities. We continue to pray for the shalom of Lakewood. We need to be on guard against false prophets and false gods that distract us from the mission of God and our covenant faithfulness to the one true God. So last week, Michael prepared us for this strange land. This week, I've titled the sermon, Living in a Strange Land. So as you know, my work takes me to some odd places on the globe. Last month, I was in India. Next month, I will be in Uganda. And in the fall, I'm going to be in Myanmar, Lord willing. And over the past 6 years with DAI, I've traveled to 12 different countries, not typically countries that you find on TripAdvisor's top 10 vacations to visit. So being in a strange land can be difficult. Unfamiliar language, food, people, noises, smells, clothing. One of the things about India that I heard about but didn't really embody until I was there is the incessant noise. Cars communicating to each other, like, excuse me, I'm going to move over, beep. Oh, you're welcome, come on in, beep. Is this space occupied? Beep. Nope, come on in, beep. It's this nice little dance that happens between vehicles, and they're constantly communicating in their own little love language called the horn. So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah no doubt would have faced some culture shock of their own when they relocated to Babylon. And just a few years earlier, Assyria ruled the world. Now Babylon rules the world. Everybody wants to rule the world. Judeans probably partied in the streets like in Nineveh when the Babylonians in 612 BC. The evil regime has toppled. But as the famous philosopher Pete Townsend once said, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, the lives of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were suddenly turned upside down. One day they were serving in the royal courts of Judah. The next day they were in shackles on their way to Babylon. They were hand-selected to be assimilated into Babylonian culture. We're not in Kansas anymore. Different language, different food, different people, different noises, smells, and clothing. And with that, these 4 young men were suddenly living in a strange land. The book of Daniel was written as a reminder to the exiled remnant to remain faithful even in the most despairing of times. It was written from the perspective of captives of world empires. It reminds the faithful of all generations that even when we feel powerless, we serve a powerful God. The mighty empires that rule over us, either from afar or in some cases among us, are temporary and will one day collapse under the authority of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Now, exactly when the book of Daniel was written is up for debate, but scholars can identify the events described in the book as occurring between 605 BC and 197 BC, thus covering 4 centuries of history. In our Bibles, the ones that I'm holding here, the one that Nancy read from, Daniel's among the prophets, along with Jeremiah, Ezekiel. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's among the writings at the end of the book, at the end of the collection, and is more closely associated with the wisdom tradition, like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. The book is neatly organized, and you've probably picked up on this yourself when you've read it. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his 3 friends. Chapters 7 through 12 contains visions by Daniel about various kingdoms and written in the first person. So chapters 1 through 6, those are the stories that you're probably familiar with, and when you think of Daniel, that's probably what comes to mind. The lion's den, the fiery furnace, the writing on the wall. The visions in 7 through 12, these are more similar to like John's visions in Revelation. Although some scholars see these visions as predictive of future events, others see them as coded language against contemporary world powers. We'll talk about that more when we get to chapters 7 through 12. But for now, just kind of give you an overview of the book of Daniel. And then finally, the language of Daniel is interesting because it and Ezra are 2 books that contain a large amount of Aramaic, not Hebrew. So actually, verses 2, 4 through 7, 8 are all written in Aramaic. Aramaic had been around for a while, for centuries, but in the 8th century, under the Neo-Assyrian Empire, it became more of a commonly used in the Assyrian Empire. And then finally, by the end of the Assyrian period and into the Babylonian period, Aramaic was the trade language. It's what they used to speak across cultures, because, as Doug can point out, Akkadian is difficult. We're going to get to that. All right, Daniel 1. Our text today is from Daniel 1, which Nancy read from for us. Their Hebrew names are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And we know the 3 names, we know the latter 3 by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or as Maria and I were talking about earlier from the Veggie Tales, Rack, Shack, and Benny. Rack, Shack, and Benny, hopefully. For some reason, we tend to ignore Daniel's Babylonian name, and we just stick with Daniel instead of Belteshazzar. Maybe it's easily confused with Belshazzar, which comes up in chapter 5, or maybe it's because the author wanted to retain Daniel's Judean identity. So for the point of, for my purposes, I want to be intentional. I'm going to be intentional about keeping the names and reciting the names that their mothers gave them in Judea. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The main story from chapter 1 is how Daniel and his 3 friends refused the royal rations over religious objections. One author in particular has made a small fortune selling books about Daniel's diet plan. And now you're thinking about food. And now that I told you you're thinking about food, you're thinking about food more. So maybe think about elephants so you don't think about food. So hold off thinking about food for a while. We're going to get back to food. So even though this idea about food is one of the lessons from Daniel 1 for living in strange land, I want to focus on 3 specific points that I am drawing from the text: language, culture, and priorities. The first lesson from Daniel 1 has to do with language in a strange land. In verses 3 through 5, we are told that Daniel and his three friends go through a cultural programming regiment. They were taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans and were to be educated for 3 years. Daniel and friends spoke Hebrew, the language of Judah, and probably also Aramaic, since they were in the royal court. And when the Assyrians invaded Judah under King Sennacherib in 701 BC, so about a century before, some of Hezekiah's officials asked the Assyrian envoy, "Please speak to your servants in the Aramaic language, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall." In other words, the court officials wanted to use code language. They wanted to speak in the lingua franca of the region, and not the Hebrew dialect that was being spoken there, because they didn't want the citizens of Judea to know what was happening. But the languages spoken in both Nineveh and in Babylon were local dialects of Akkadian. Like Hebrew and Aramaic, Akkadian is also in the Semitic language family. But those of you who have studied languages know that family languages doesn't necessarily mean ease of communication. So right now, Karen is studying French. She studied French a long time ago. She's trying to get back some of that French language acquisition. I'm studying Spanish. Both are Romance languages. If I say something to her in Spanish, she'll have a better understanding of me than I will of her saying something to me in French. That's just how it is. So even though they're in the same family, doesn't mean that they're necessarily understood. So Akkadian is not something that would have been easily understood. You may or may not know that my PhD is in Hebraic and cognate studies, and Doug and I were talking a few weeks ago, have a lot of similarities in our educational background. So we geeked out over that for a few minutes on that. I spent a year in seminary studying Akkadian. Not many seminarians go to seminary to study Akkadian, just so you know. If you're worried about sending your kids off to seminary and then being indoctrinated in Babylonian, don't worry. That's not part of the core curriculum. And then 4 years I studied Akkadian in grad school and took one of my comprehensive exams in Akkadian. So I've studied quite a bit of Akkadian. Forgot most of my Akkadian. But Daniel and his friends studied it for 3 years. Quick side story on that. When I was studying Akkadian, there was what we had called the cuneiform study room. Cuneiform is just a type of writing that they use. So taking a reed and pressing it into clay and make some marks in it, and that's the script. The alphabet we have, trust me, is much easier. So I took a passage from Jeremiah 5:15 and I put it on the door to the CSR, Cuneiform Study Room. It reads in Hebrew, Goy etanhu, goy me'olamhu, goy lo teda lashano, velo tishma mayadaber. And Doug is back there just laughing at the joke. It's an eternal nation. It's a nation from of old, a nation whose language you can't know, and no one can understand what it's saying. So I put that on the Cuneiform Studies room. It's kind of as a reminder, ye who enter, some sort of warning about entering this room. But learning someone else's language isn't just about communication. Language is at the core of one's culture. It's at the core of who we are. Language is more than just vocabulary, words, and grammar. A professor at the Université de Béchar in Algeria says language always carries meanings and references beyond itself. The meanings of a particular language represent the culture of a particular social group. To interact with a language means to do so with the culture, which is its reference point. We could not understand a culture without having direct access to its language because of their intimate connection. What are the languages of Lakewood? Can we really be witnesses to the love of Jesus in Lakewood if we don't learn its various languages? The language of Belmar is different than the language of Rose Stein, which is different than the language of CCU, which is different than the language of Yarrow Street. There are a lot of languages in Lakewood. Like Daniel and his friends, we need to learn to be multilingual. What about the language of River Church? What about the languages of the various churches who are gathering at this facility? What about the language of the Way and the Mix and Comunidad Cristiana Colorado? You've probably noticed we have our own languages, our own cultures. Pastor Dale will have his own language. We'll need to learn his language as much as he'll need to learn ours. When there's inevitable miscommunication, it may very well be due to a language barrier. We may understand the words, but we may interpret them differently. It will take time to learn each other's languages. Hopefully not 3 years, but it'll take time. The second lesson from Daniel 1 has to do with the culture in a strange land. Daniel 1, 8 through 17 says, in Daniel 1, 8 through 17, we learn how Daniel refused to defile himself with the king's rations. Okay, if you haven't stopped thinking about food, you can think about food now. Readers of the Bible tend to look for the moral of the story. And the moral of this story seems to be that God gives favor on those who refuse to defile themselves. So a typical application for this story from Daniel 1 is one of separation from worldly vices. The world is bad. Government is bad. Authority is bad. Other religions are bad. Other cultures are bad. Everything that contradicts me and my beliefs is bad. But I want to draw our attention on two words from the NRSV, and I forgot to pick up on what the NIV used for these. The NRV says that Daniel resolved that he wouldn't defile himself. Other translations say he was determined or made up his mind. In other words, this plan was one Daniel came up with on his own. If he prayed about it beforehand, we're not told that he did. So we can't assume that he did. He assessed the situation, concluded that it violated his conscience, and decided to do something about it. So this is a sub-point. This isn't a main point. But a sub-point is we don't have to pray about every decision. I don't have to pray about which flavor of ice cream I choose, nor do I have to pray about whether I should be kind to my neighbor. The Lord has given us Scripture. The Lord has given us reason. The Lord has given us wisdom. And the Lord has given us the counsel of others to help us in making those decisions. When we pray without ceasing, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, our desires will align with the Lord's desires. I mean, the Lord loves chocolate chip cookie dough, and I don't need to pray about that because I know that that's what he loves. That's a joke, not even a smile, not even my ice cream loving wife. She smiled. I turned away too soon. Proverbs 3, 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with, she's not smiling because obviously it's chocolate mint, right? Something like that. Mint chocolate. Proverbs 3, 5, 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. Second, Daniel was concerned about defiling himself. So this word for defile only occurs 9 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. It's the only time where it is used with respect to defiling oneself. But in each case, it has to do with making something ritually unclean, unfit to be in the presence of the Lord. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us the timeline of the events in Daniel chapter 1, but it presents us to things as sort of a rapid-fire order. They're taken to Babylon. They're immediately deprogrammed from their Judean culture into the Babylonian culture. So one might assume that Daniel has his defenses up. He doesn't know. All he knows is that those heathen Babylonians are going to try to get him to eat something that has been sacrificed to idols. Who knows? He's heard the stories. So he puts up his guard. I'm not going to eat it. He's not going to defile himself. Based on what we know about royal rations, though, there's no reason to assume that Daniel and his friends would have been offered meat necessarily. It's most likely that the rations were baked bread and wine. And as we know, neither bread nor wine violate any Jewish dietary laws, so why was he so determined not to eat the royal rations? As I mentioned, when they were taken captive, they were given a complete cultural cleanse. They were forced to learn the language, change their names, and now forced to eat their food. John Goldingay, who is a professor of Old Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary, wrote in his commentary, accepting the palace provisions involves a compromise of faith in a way that accepting a share in its life, its education, and its names do not. Walton, Matthews, and Chavalis similarly say they seize on one of the few areas where they can still exercise choice as an opportunity to preserve their distinct identity. Sometimes it's hard to draw the line between what is distinctly Christian about our faith and what has been assimilated into our faith from the culture around us. I'm teaching an online course at Denver Seminary right now called Theology and Religion of Ancient Israel. And one of the weekly discussion questions a few weeks ago was on this very issue. How has culture influenced the church and vice versa? And it was interesting to listen to some of the students' perspectives on this, as they mentioned things like consumerism, celebrity status, music styles, Sunday morning production, busyness, as part of culture that has infiltrated the church. One student, as they were preparing for Easter, was in a meeting with their church leadership team, and somebody in the leadership team said, so they're having an Easter egg hunt between services. And one of the leaders in the group suggested that maybe they should consider canceling communion so they would have time for the Easter egg hunt. And the student was kind of scratching his head and said, do we have our priorities in line here? Are we missing something? Ultimately, cooler heads prevailed, and they kept communion in the service. 75 years ago, Richard Niebuhr first articulated the available options for Christian engagement with the world. He defined these as 1, Christ against culture, that is separation of church and culture. You might think of the Amish as one end of that spectrum. The second is the Christ of culture, where culture is interpreted through the lens of Christ and vice versa. Number 3, Christ above culture. That is, the church acts as a guardian of divine law while living in harmony with a secular society. The fourth is Christ and culture in paradox, a conflict between Christ and culture due to sin. And the fifth one is Christ, the transformer of culture. The church works to improve culture. Niebuhr doesn't suggest which one is best, but urges a robust discussion guided by faith. And he says the following: to make our decisions in faith is to make them in view of the fact that no single man or person or group or historical time is the church. No single man, group, or historical time is the church. But that there is a church of faith which we do our partial relative work and on which we count. It is to make them in view of the fact that the Christ is risen from the dead, and it is not only the head of the church, but the Redeemer of the world. It is to make them in view of the fact that the world of culture, man's achievement, exists with a world of grace, God's kingdom. And the third lesson from Daniel 1 pertains to priorities in a strange land. This is also found in Daniel 1, 8 through 17. And did you notice when Nancy read that in the context of Daniel refusing to defile himself, he asked Ashpenaz for permission? Remaining undefiled was important to Daniel, but he didn't demand it. When Ashpenaz objected, Daniel didn't threaten him with retribution from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Instead, Daniel asked instead. He asked in a way that put Ashpenaz in control. Daniel suggested a 10-day money-back guarantee. If it doesn't work, Daniel and his friends wouldn't object to whatever Ashpenaz had in mind. He respected the position of the palace master, and we'll learn later on that this respect will pay dividends for Daniel and his friends. In Central Europe, from 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War claimed the lives of up to 8 million soldiers and civilians. They died from battle, famine, and disease. Some parts of Germany lost over half of its population. The war was ignited over tensions between Catholics and Protestants stemming from the Protestant Reformation a century before. About 10 years into the war, German theologian Rupertus Meldenius penned these famous lines. And in fact, Nicole had them on her door. They may still be there, I'm not sure. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. Daniel's diet was important to him. He didn't want to defile himself. But it wasn't an essential. So he was willing to compromise on a non-essential here. He didn't want to, but if it came to it, he would. And in the coming weeks, we'll discover where those lines are that he was not willing to cross. So as I conclude, let me just kind of remind us the ground that we covered in the last few minutes. First one is language in a strange land. To understand people and relate with people, we need to learn their language. The second one is culture in a strange land. What is the relationship between Christ and culture? What do you see as the relationship between your faith and culture? How much of culture influences your faith and vice versa? And number 3, priorities in a strange land. In essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. Let me pray, and I will pray for the offering.